Imagine being in total darkness. It's unfathomable. There always seems to be a source of light, no matter where you are. However, in the deep depths of a cave, someone can experience true darkness, a darkness so black that you can taste it. This is what Ted and his friend B found in Mystery Cave, a darkness and an evil that would change their lives forever. We're about to take you into one of the first creepypasta stories ever created on the internet. Creepypasta is the term for horror stories and legends that are shared on the internet. They're user-generated and tend to be created only to terrify or enthrall others. We're warning you now that this story will likely give you nightmares, and by the end, you'll need to decide for yourself whether Ted the Caver's story is true or if there's something else going on. Ted the Caver is claimed by many to be one of the first creepypasta stories ever put in the internet. It all started with an Angel Fire website created by Ted, where he chronicled his story of exploring a mysterious cave in journal format. Each journal entry pulls us deeper and deeper into his story and the horrors that were encountered while in the cave. December 30th, 2000. The journal begins. This was the first time Ted and B went to Mystery Cave together. B and Ted had been caving together for several months. B had injured himself in a caving accident a few years prior and was told by doctors he would never walk again. But B was strong and he didn't give up. He worked hard and was not only able to walk again but managed to recover enough to start exploring caves again. He would never be as fast as he once was, but he was able to do almost anything he put his mind to. Ted had explored Mystery Cave before and had come across a small hole at the end of one of the tunnels that appeared to lead to another chamber. This hole was interesting for several reasons. The first was that there seemed to be a constant stream of blowing air out of it. Ted wasn't sure why this was happening, but he thought if he could find a way to make the hole bigger and fit inside, he'd be able to decipher the mysterious source of the air. B and Ted anchored a rope to a thick tree outside the opening of the cave and threw it in. In order to enter the cave system, they needed to rappel into the maw of darkness. They carried backup lights with them along with glow sticks that could be used in emergency situations. After descending over the several ledges into the cave, Ted and B came to a crawl space where they needed to get on their hands and knees. The tunnel emptied out into a large room with 4 passageways. The 2 tunnels to the left both led to dead ends. The one second from the right led to a pool of stagnant water, while the tunnel on the far right terminated at the small hole Ted wanted to explore. When they reached the hole and began to examine it, they both agreed that it was possible that the tunnel on the other side opened up and connected to a virgin cave. This is what cavers call a chamber that's never been explored before. It's the holy grail of caving. Being the first person ever to step foot in a chamber or a tunnel system that's been sealed off for thousands or even millions of years is a spiritual experience. Both Ted and B hoped that if they were able to widen the hole enough, they could slip through and explore what lay beyond. Using his Kodak disposable camera, Ted took a picture of the hole with a glove in it for a size comparison and uploaded it to his website. There's no way that Ted and B could fit through the current hole unless they could make it larger. But when B saw it, he became as excited as Ted was. B and Ted brainstormed how to make the hole larger. It appeared that even once they got through the hole, the tight squeeze went back another 10 to 12 feet before it really opened up. This meant that they would need to slowly shimmy their way through the rocks, squeezing in on them from all sides. This would not be a journey for anyone that was claustrophobic. As Ted and B discussed their plan of attack, the first creepy phenomenon occurred. The wind blowing through the hole continued to howl. It was an eerie noise that had no clear source. B held up his hand to indicate that Ted should stop talking and listen. Underneath the howling of the wind, a low rumbling sound could be heard. This new noise would only happen every now and then and was thought to be made by large trucks driving over the cave. The 2 cavers shrugged it off and continued discussing how they would open up the hole so they could fit through. They decided that by using a battery-powered drill along with bullpins and a sledgehammer, they could chip away at the sides of the hole and widen it. Before they left for the day, Ted named the passage Floyd's Tomb after Floyd Collins, who discovered parts of what would become Mammoth Cave National Park. Floyd had died from dehydration and exposure to hypothermia after being trapped in the cave system for 14 days when a cave-in occurred. This was just an ironic name given to the passage, but in the coming months, Floyd's Tomb would be living up to its name. After leaving Mystery Cave, Ted went home and chronicled what he and B had found and what their plan was going to be. He created a crude drawing of Floyd's tomb so that other cavers had a clearer idea of what the system looked like. January 27th and 28, 2001. About a month had passed before Ted and B returned to Mystery Cave with the tools they needed to start enlarging the hole to Floyd's tomb. Carrying the heavy equipment down into the cave was tedious, and working in the cramped conditions to chisel away at the sides of the hole was difficult. The 2 men had to remain crouched, and only one person could work at a time due to limited space. As one person worked, the other would rest in the darkness, contemplating what awaited them on the other side of the hole. They used the cordless drill to slowly scrape away the rock along the sides of the hole, along with a chisel and a 5-pound sledgehammer to remove larger chunks of rock. It was slow going and a lot of work, but the men were determined to get through. After some time, their first drill battery died. In the silence, they could hear the wind howling through the hole. It seemed to be blowing stronger than the last time. But it was the low rumbling sound that they couldn't explain. This noise was also getting louder, which didn't make sense if it was only trucks passing overhead. It was as if something deep inside the cave was getting closer, but this terrifying thought was pushed to the back of their minds. After their second drill battery died, Ted and Bee had to call it a day. They packed up and ascended to the surface. To make their lives easier, they left some equipment in a large crack in the cave so they wouldn't have to carry it all back down into the hole in the future. They slept in a hotel that night and woke up late from the exhaustion that accompanied the drilling and hammering of the day before. Once they were both awake, they had something to eat and headed back to Mystery Cave to continue their work. February 10, 2001. Bee had asked some of his other caving friends what the noises that they were hearing might be. They suggested the sounds could be coming from an underground waterfall. This just intensified Ted and Bee's desire to get to the other side. On this trip, Whip, Bee's Jack Russell Terrier, joined the two cavers in their mission. This was not Whip's first time in caves, and Bee had a special harness that allowed them to lower her safely into Mystery Cave. The plan was to put Whip into the small hole to see how far she would go to find out just how far the passage went. After the party had reached the final landing and proceeded toward the hole, Whip began sniffing around. She ran from side to side, excited by all the new smells, and when they reached the chamber where the 4 tunnels were located, something strange began to happen. Whip entered the chamber and her demeanor immediately changed. She became skittish and would not leave Ted and Bee's side. It was as if Whip could sense something was wrong. As they approached the hole, the hair on the ridge of Whip's back stood on end. The dog began to growl, then her tail went between her legs and she began to whimper. Whip seemed to be scared of something lurking in the darkness. Ted and Bee got to work on the hole while Whip lay on the rope bag. She would whimper every now and then and refuse to approach the hole. In hindsight, Ted remembered that while they were working, Whip didn't take her eyes off the hole. It was as if she was waiting for something to come out of it, and from how scared she was, it wouldn't be anything good. Bee had just finished drilling and was going to chisel away some rock when he froze. He had a puzzled look on his face, so Ted asked him what was up. Bee shook his head and held his flashlight up so he could see down the shaft. He told Ted he had heard a strange noise. It sounded like rock grinding against rock. They both shrugged it off and figured it would just be another mystery they'd solve once they got through the hole. When the last battery died, Ted looked at the hole. He was positive he could fit his head through it. He was right. Both of the cavers laughed with joy. They'd made some serious progress. When Ted went silent, Bee asked what was wrong, to which Ted responded that the wind had stopped blowing. Both of them remembered the wind howling when they started digging earlier, but couldn't remember when it stopped. The stillness filled the air as Ted noticed that the low rumbling had also ceased. They seemed to be uncovering more mysteries than answers the further they got along. March 3, 2001. Due to scheduling conflicts, Ted and Bee hadn't been back to the cave in 3 weeks. Bee left Whip at home this time for obvious reasons. When they reached the hole, both of them noticed the breeze had resumed blowing and the rumbling was back. They continued working for several hours until they were on their final battery. This was when they heard the most terrifying sound of their lives. The drill was whirring down when a blood-curdling scream emanated out of the hole. It echoed down the cavern as Ted stared wide-eyed at the opening. He turned to look at Bee, who had been napping but was now sitting straight up with his mouth agape. What the hell was that? They asked one another. Ted turned back toward the hole. In the back of his mind, he expected to find a demonic face peering at him through the hole, but all he could see was darkness. He shone his light down the tunnel looking for any movement, but nothing was there. Bee scrambled toward the hole and told Ted to shove rocks into the opening. He thought that maybe there was an animal on the other side of the hole that somehow got trapped down there. The two cavers loaded the hole with rocks to keep whatever was on the other side from coming through the hole. They waited for several minutes to see if anything would happen. No other sounds could be heard. Eventually, they decided it'd be okay to get back to work, but they would both keep an eye on the hole for any signs of movement. They'd come so far, and they couldn't let their imagination stop them. The urge to discover the Virgin Cave was just too great. The sound was probably just echoes within the cave playing tricks on them. They removed the rocks that they'd shoved into the hole. It was after the last rock came out that Ted noticed the wind had stopped blowing and the rumbling noise had gone silent. March 4, 2001. The two cavers climbed eagerly back into the cave, all but forgetting the terrifying scream from the day before. The breeze and rumbling were both back. After a few hours of working, Bee let out a cheer. When he turned around, Ted could see a relatively large section of rock had come off, and now looked like the hole was big enough for him to climb through. It would be an incredibly tight fit, but Ted was almost positive he could squeeze his body into it. Ted wiggled his body into the hole. The rocks scraped at his skin from all sides, but he could fit. Ted continued into the tomb and found that the shaft began to close in around him as he got further. His hips cleared the entrance and he continued to wiggle forward. Ted couldn't really see what was in front of him, as the only way to continue through Floyd's tomb was to keep his head tilted to the side. When he was fully within the shaft, Ted decided it'd be a good time to make sure he could get back out. B tied ropes to his feet and helped pull him back if he got stuck. He had come so far, and Ted needed to know if he could reach the end of Floyd's tomb and come out the other side. Ted continued to crawl forward as the passageway got smaller and smaller. By the end, he could barely move. His body became wedged between the rocks. The only way to continue was to exhale all of the air in his lungs to reduce the size of his chest cavity. By doing this, he'd be able to squeeze through if they could remove a few more rocks. Ted crawled back through the shaft and came out smiling at B. He explained that it was possible for him to get through, and all they needed was to scrape the edges of the passageway in order for him to get to the other side. B was elated. April 7, 2001. Ted and B returned to Mystery Cave with a homemade scraping tool that Ted's neighbor had helped him weld together. Once they were in the cave, B used it to clear the rock walls and Floyd's tomb of any protrusions. When they were both satisfied that the walls were now smooth enough for Ted to get all the way through, he entered. Ted knew that this was it. He didn't even bother tying the rope to his feet. Ted shimmied his way through the shaft using the method from the previous attempt. Exhale, scoot, stop to breathe, repeat. Ted reached the end, where it began to open up. He yelled back to B that he was almost there. Beer cheered him on. Virgin Passage, Neil Armstrong territory, he shouted. Then it happened. Ted's head popped out into the Virgin Cave. He'd done it. They both celebrated on opposite sides of Floyd's tomb. A somber feeling came over Ted as he realized that since B was a bigger guy, he'd never be able to make it through the narrow passageway. Ted did his best to describe what he was seeing as he scanned the new cave system with his flashlight. B threw a rope through Floyd's tomb, which Ted could grab and pull his gear through the shaft with. Once he had his helmet and camera, Ted took a picture to show B later on. However, if Ted got into trouble, there'd be no way for B to get to him. They decided that Ted would explore the new cave system but would stay within shouting distance in case something went wrong. Ted headed down the passage, yelling back at B every now and then to make sure he could hear him. The walls looked similar to Mystery Cave. Ted had only made it a few hundred feet before he could no longer hear B. The tunnel seemed to be going on forever. Both Ted and B were desperate to find out what other secrets this cave held. They decided that Ted would go off and explore on his own for half an hour. If something happened and Ted didn't return after the allotted time, B would head to the surface and get help. As Ted headed deeper into the darkness of the cave, the tunnels began to open up. He could now stand and move freely. The first really interesting formation he came across was a set of crystals embedded in the cave wall. He continued on and the tunnel opened up into a larger chamber. It was here that Ted came across the most surprising find yet. At the end of this room was a large round rock that was propped up against the wall. Ted was able to take a picture of the entrance of the chamber where the leaning stone could be seen coming out of the darkness. As Ted entered the chamber with the large egg-shaped rock in it, he began to feel uneasy. He'd had the feeling someone was watching him. Once he was in the room, he saw another tunnel on the far side. An overwhelming sense of being alone washed over Ted as he stood in the cave. His half hour was almost up, so he turned to head back to B when something caught his eye. On one of the walls, there were drawings. It was clear that the diagrams were ancient. The pictogram consisted of a group of people standing below some unknown symbol, raising their hands up in exultation. Ted snapped a quick photo and rushed back toward Floyd's tomb, excited to tell B about everything he found. Not only was this an amazing discovery, but the drawings meant there was another way into this section of the cave. Ted got back into the hole and spewed words out at B. He was so excited and talked so fast that B had to tell him to relax and slow down. Ted took a breath and told B about everything he found. Then Ted passed his gear back through the shaft. Once it was clear and B gave him a go-ahead, Ted entered Floyd's tomb head first and began to crawl back toward B, who took a picture of him. As Ted made his way back through the shaft, he heard a sound coming from behind him. It was faint and sounded like rock sliding on rock. Ted froze, trying to make out the sound and where it was coming from. Ted continued his journey forward and exited the shaft. He didn't say anything to B about the sound. A few days later, Ted got the pictures developed from his disposable camera. When he flipped through the images, he noticed something incredibly strange. All of the photos leading up to the large room with the rock leaning against the wall came out great, but any pictures taken in the room itself were blank. April 14, 2001. It was decided that in order for the Virgin Cave to be properly explored, Ted and B would need to bring in someone else. They recruited a fellow caver named Joe. Joe was an experienced caver and had a very thin frame. This made him ideal for making it through Floyd's tomb and entering the Virgin Cave. The three cavers entered and descended the hole leading to the new chamber. Ted and B did not tell Joe about the weird things they experienced previously in the cave, as they didn't see any benefit to doing so. Joe and Ted entered the hole and made it into the next section of the cave. B passed the gear through, and as Ted went to grab his stuff, he slammed his head against the cave wall. His head throbbed. B sent the first aid kit through the passage, but Ted didn't feel so good. He likely had a concussion. Ted wouldn't be able to explore the cave that day, but he still wanted Joe to see what he had found in the big room at the end of the tunnel. Ted told Joe to go on without him and informed him to keep an eye out. Ted waited until Joe's light disappeared and then went back through the shaft to hang out with B until Joe got back. Time went by, and Joe didn't return. B began yelling Joe's name, but there was no response. Ted prepared to go back through Floyd's tomb to go search for Joe. Suddenly, a light shone out through the end of the tunnel. "Joe?" Ted called out. "Are you okay?" "No," was the only reply that Joe gave. Joe climbed through the shaft and exited. He was ghost white and said he didn't feel so well. Ted and B asked him what happened, but Joe ignored them and headed for the cave's exit. Ted and B quickly gathered up all their equipment and followed Joe. When they exited, Joe walked straight to the car and got in. All Joe said was that he felt terrible and wanted to go home. When Ted asked Joe if he heard them yelling or if he saw the egg-shaped rock, Joe told him no. When they dropped Joe off at his house, Ted and B told him they were going to go back to the cave at some point and asked if he wanted to go with them. Joe shook his head, turned toward his house, and went inside without saying another word. April 28, 2001. Ted and B tried to check in on Joe, but he wouldn't answer his phone or open his door for anyone. They decided they had to go back into the cave and continue exploring it for answers. Before entering the cave, Ted and B informed a local cave rescue group of what they were doing in case anything went wrong. They were given a two-way phone that connected via a thin wire. This would allow B and Ted to stay in constant communication as Ted explored the Virgin Cave system. When Ted and B entered the cave that day, it was clear something didn't want them there. Nothing went smoothly. Knots had to be retied and clips kept breaking. Eventually, they got to the hole. This time, Ted had brought a video camera with him, which he would bring into the cave to document everything he saw. He climbed through Floyd's tomb and had B pass him all of his gear and one of the two-way telephones. As Ted walked down the Virgin Cave's dark tunnels, he unspooled the phone's wire. Every few minutes, he'd pick up the receiver and talk to B, so they both knew that everything was all right. Ted reached the room with the large rock. As soon as he entered the chamber, he began to feel strange. He looked around the room and saw nothing out of place, so he continued toward the far side of the room to enter the next tunnel. The entire time he'd been traveling through the cave, he'd been recording using the video camcorder. The new passage somehow appeared darker than the rest of the cave. It was as if it consumed any light that entered it. Ted took a deep breath and proceeded into the tunnel. As he stepped forward, shards of broken rock cracked under his feet. He made it several feet into the passageway when he heard a noise. It was the sound of rock scraping against rock. It was coming from the large room that he had just come from. Startled by the sound, Ted stood up abruptly and slammed his helmet against the solid rock ceiling. This caused him to crumple to the ground in pain. The impact damaged the light on top of his helmet. He sat in complete darkness for a moment before scrambling through his bag to find his emergency glow sticks. He was afraid to crack them because of what the green glow might reveal, but there was no other choice. If he was going to get out of here, he needed to see. Ted cracked the glow stick and strained to see what was moving in the other room. Nothing was there. Ted scrambled to pick up the phone and whispered into it for B to pick up, but the line was dead. Ted was paralyzed with fear, but something might have happened to B. He mustered what little courage he had left, cracked another glow stick, and threw it into the room to help illuminate it. The glow stick rolled across the ground and circled behind the large rock that had been leaning against the wall. When the glow stick rolled behind it, the light seemed to disappear. Ted hadn't seen anything in the room, but that didn't really reassure him. Either way, he needed to get back to B. Ted slowly stood up and followed the phone wire back the way he came. He could only see a few feet in front of him using his glow sticks and a small backup lamp he had in his bag. When Ted reached the part of the chamber with the cave art, the symbol seemed to glow. He moved on, continuing to follow the cord of the phone. This led him toward a large stone. As he approached, Ted noticed something strange. The rock seemed to have shifted. Then it all clicked. That scraping sound he'd heard was this large rock being moved. A flood of terror filled his body. Someone or something was in the cave with him. When he reached the rock, he noticed it was now sitting directly on the phone wire. It had severed the cord in two, which is why he couldn't reach B. Ted peered over the rock to see where the glow stick had gone. Where the stone once rested was a deep, dark hole. The rock had acted like a door that had been shut, but now the gateway was open. Ted shrieked in horror and began moving as fast as he could away from the chamber and toward Floyd's tomb. As he crouched and proceeded down the passageways, he banged and scraped his body into the jagged rocks. Ted was too afraid to turn around, but he couldn't help but imagine a legion of demons pursuing him through the tunnels. He reached the point where he could yell to B. Ted screamed his name. B asked if he was all right. Ted just shouted for him to get out of the cave as fast as he could. Ted reached Floyd's tomb and shoved his gear into the hole. It was at this point he realized that he had dropped the video camera when he slammed his head into the ceiling of the tunnel. For a split second, Ted thought about going back for it, but then the fear overcame him and he began to crawl through the shaft toward B. As he snaked forward, he could see that B was just starting to head down the tunnel toward the exit. Then, Ted smelled something awful wafting into the passage behind him. It smelled like decaying, rotting, putrid death. The smell was overpowering, and Ted began to gag. He continued to crawl as fast as he could, trying to get out of the tomb and away from the smell. Ted popped out of the hole and rolled to the ground. He was in so much pain he could barely breathe, but as he lay there, he could hear a scraping sound coming from the other side of the hole. Ted scrambled onto his feet and ran after B. B had already begun ascending the ropes toward the top of the cave. Ted had no time to harness up or clip in, so he began to free climb. If he lost his grip, he would plummet to his death. Ted and B vigorously climbed toward the entrance of the cave. Ted caught up to his friend on the final ledge. The smell of death had followed them toward the exit of the cave. Ted watched as B made the final climb to the mouth of the cave. Then he heard a strange sound like a zipper unzipping. He looked down at his feet and noticed that the excess rope was being pulled back into the cave. Something in the darkness was trying to drag them back in. Ted let out a scream and then scrambled up the rope. Just as he reached the top, he felt the rope go taut. Whatever was in the blackness was almost upon him. Ted looked up in terror. B leaned over and pulled him over the ledge. They lay on the ground outside the mouth of the cave when the tree next to them began to creak. The rope they'd climbed up was moving back and forth as if something else was using it to climb out of the cave. B jumped to his feet, pulled out his pocket knife, and began cutting the rope. It frayed as Ted pleaded with B to hurry. Then the rope snapped and fell back into the blackness of the cave and disappeared. They both sat there staring at the cave opening. After an unknown amount of time, they stood up, walked to the truck, and drove away. Neither one said a word the whole way home. May 19, 2001. Ted wrote a message to his readers. He wanted to update everyone on how he was doing after his last post. Many people reached out to him, but he just didn't have the time to respond until now. He'd been having nightmares and had been seeing things in the night. There was a shadowy figure that seemed to be following him around and noises that he could not explain. Then one night, he had an overwhelming urge to drive to Overlook Point, where he could see the city lights. Some unknown force was pulling him there. When he arrived, he noticed another car parked at the Overlook with a dark figure leaning against the hood of the car. When Ted pulled up and exited his vehicle, he found that the person was Joe. When Joe saw Ted, he just nodded. It was clear that they'd experienced similar encounters in the cave. They only said a few words. "We need to return. Tomorrow good?" Ted asked. "Yeah, noon," Joe replied. Ted nodded, and they both got back in their cars and drove away. Ted headed to B's house next. They hadn't talked since their experience in Mystery Cave. Ted knocked on B's door. When he opened it, he welcomed Ted in. It was a little awkward, but Ted got straight to the point. "I just ran into Joe, and we're going back in tomorrow at noon." B said nothing. He just nodded his head. He offered for Ted to stay the night so they could head out together the next day. The post ends by telling the reader that Ted, Joe, and B would already have left for Mystery Cave by the time anyone read the message. They wanted to find out what happened after they last saw the cave. Would they be able to recover the video camera and see what was on it? And if they went back into the cave, would they make it back out? Ted wrote that the reason they were going back was to find some sort of closure. He left the reader with this final thought. "For my family and friends who are reading this, I say, be at peace. I will conquer this cave. Then I will return and update this website immediately. I will include any photos we take in the cave today, and if you stop by the house, I'll show you the video I have. I expect to be home later tonight or tomorrow at the latest. See all of you soon with a lot of answers. Love, Ted." So, what did Ted the Caver find? Is this a true story, and where is the cave? After some deep digging, some of these questions can be answered. In this story, Ted hypothesizes the monster they encountered was an ancient creature called a hodag. There's no evidence that this creature exists, but it could be one explanation. Some believe that the Ted the Caver story was plagiarized by Ted from a short story titled The Fear of Darkness by Thomas Lira. However, it's now widely accepted by the internet community that it was actually the other way around. Ted's story was the original, and Lira was the one who plagiarized and fabricated an earlier publication date. The two stories are almost identical except for a few details. The most promising evidence for where Ted the Caver story came from comes from a post in a caver forum by Ted himself, or at least someone who claims to be Ted. This person states that he wrote the story and then gives a number of details about the characters who were based on real people in his life. He then has these people corroborate the story. If we are to believe that this person really is Ted, and that the people who support his claims are really the people in the story, then the answer to the question, is Ted the Caver a true story, is no. The person claiming to be Ted said that Mystery Cave exists and even explained exactly where it was. The cave is called Interstate Cave or Freeway Cave and is part of the Timpanogos Cave network in Utah. The person who wrote the post says that the freeway that runs over these caves creates creepy sounds that reverberate through the chambers. This is what inspired the story. The hole was real, and Ted and his friend did carve it out so they could explore further into the cave system, but that's where the truth ends. There was no creature, they did not need to run for their lives. If we're to believe the poster is Ted, the cave is real, the rumbling is real, and everything else is fake. However, there are those who believe that this post was created to hide the truth about what Ted the Caver found, and that there's a deep dark secret hiding somewhere in a cave system in the United States. Now watch Smile Dog Creepypasta Explained, or check out Monster Stalks Your Nightmares, Jeff the Killer Explained, short animated film.